Greetings. Welcome Open Learning 18 folks and anybody else who is dropping by. I'm Gardner Campbell. I'm the Hub Director for Open Learning 18 and really excited today to be able to have a chat with Jeffrey Pomerantz, who along with the late Robin Peake is the author of 50 Shades of Open. It was our lead-off essay in 2017, and I can't think of a better way to lead things off in 2018. If we're going to be talking about open and all the opens connected, we'd better get all the 50 shades as well, or at least as many as we can count on the fingers of a couple of hands. So thank you very much for being with us today, Jeffrey.
Thank you very much for doing this.
So I'll start off by asking just kind of a general question. What's the backstory? What's the origin story? What got you and Robin interested in writing this particular article at this particular time? What were some of the motivations that you felt as you were starting on this project?
Well, Robin Peake and I have known each other for a long, long time. She was a mentor of mine as a master's student, and we've been writing together for my entire career. Very early on, what we were writing about was electronic scholarly publishing back in the 90s, when publishers were just starting to get into publishing articles and texts online. And we were looking at some of the early experiments and projects in that arena. So we've been looking at online publishing together for an awfully long time. And Robin introduced me to Peter Suber, who is, of course, at Harvard Open Access Project, and we've worked a little bit together. And through that relationship with Peter, brought in open access into this long conversation that Robin and I have been having on publishing. And we realized that as the term starts getting used more and more, and we started seeing it sort of leaking into other uses outside of open access and open source, which were really the two biggies at first, that it started to lose some of the meaning that we thought was sort of obvious at the beginning when we started talking about open access, and realized that as more and more communities started using the term open, it was starting to fuzz out a bit and become more and more confusing. And we both come out of library and information science. So naturally, our first thought was we need to do the Oxford English Dictionary thing and just articulate all of the different meanings and see if we can try to pin that particular jello to the wall a bit. So that was really the motivation. It was an attempt to get our own thinking clear, but also to help as the term inevitably leaks out into the world, so that future communities can say, well, what we really mean is this particular flavor of open and not these other things.
So that brings in a really obvious follow-up question, which is, as you work to disambiguate, or to use the metaphor you've been using, to stop the leakage, or at least to keep things straight where they can be straight, which is very much the kind of taxonomic responsibility of an information scientist. What are you trying to disambiguate it from? Where are the leaks that seem to be most problematic? Because words are always slippery and leaky things, as the OED amply demonstrates. But what were the particular ambiguities that you wanted to try to forestall, if possible, with the kind of taxonomy you were coming up with?
Well, the one that we spend a lot of time on at the beginning of the paper is free. Right, that comes out of the GNU project and Richard Stallman's Free Software Foundation. And what happened was the term free for free software came first, really, and then open source split off from that. So that was the initial dichotomy that had to be kind of clarified a little bit. And honestly, I don't think that we did a very good job of differentiating between free and open. But we had to point out that that was the origin of the term in the way that we tend to mean it. What we were trying to guard against, to the extent that we were trying to guard against something, was the breakdown of meaning of the term open, right? We spend some time in the middle end of the paper talking about, frankly, very silly uses of the term open. Uses of open that aren't about the resource being provided, that instead we're talking about a mechanism for making resources available. So it shifts the openness back a bit. And that's a little misleading, although still there can be openness there. And then the whole problem of open washing, vendors in particular, saying such and such a thing is open as a marketing tactic, right? Which is misleading at best, and at worst, I'd rather not think about. So really what we were trying to do was identify what openness, where the bounds of real openness are, as opposed to just using it as a term because it's a sexy term.
So in some respects, it sounds like your project was not just to get to open as a condition or as a kind of an ontological assertion, but to think about ways in which open conveys values, or even in Stallman's case, there was a manifesto. He called it a manifesto, meaning a way to make one's values and one's kind of moral orientation explicit. So to what extent, I mean, here we're on the boundary between information science and moral philosophy, which is very interesting, right? The way we term and describe our world also conveys a set of values. Talk a little bit more about that thing that it became something you didn't even want to talk about. Just that thing that happens when the word open is appropriated for a set of values, or one might even say, with more or less reliability, an agenda of some kind that seems contrary to the values asserted in some of these original uses of open.
Well, at this point, I'll say you can't really tell from the shot, but I'm making a political statement and wearing my Creative Commons T-shirt here. So there's my ethical statement. You had mentioned in our email exchanges prior to this conversation that you're using hypothesis as a way of sort of sidebar discussing the article, and I've actually been looking at the hypothesis comments on our paper. And I mean, I know rule number 1 of the internet is never read the comments, but these are sort of a higher class of comments, really. And one of the commenters makes what I think is an excellent point, which is that there needs to be an ethical framework around openness, which we really don't get into at all in this particular paper. That there's all kinds of really interesting and important conversations going on right now about algorithmic inequality and algorithmic oppression and whatnot. And you get work by folks like Zeynep Tufekci and Safiya Noble writing about these sorts of things, where particularly with open source software, you get the possibility of reuse of open materials, right? What we talk about in the paper very briefly is that it's this sort of virtuous cycle that openness breeds more openness. We didn't necessarily mean virtuous as socially beneficial. It's just the term that gets used. But this particular commenter says, right, that's not necessarily a social benefit, that you have to have some kind of ethical framework for looking at the artifacts that are being reused. And I think that's a critical frame that somebody needs to bring to bear on open resources generally. I'm not sure that I'm qualified to make that kind of an argument, but I don't know that I would go so far as to write a Stallman-style manifesto. not sure I'm in the manifesto type, but that is, I think, a critical conversation that needs to be had about what the ethical framework for reuse of open resources, and what that implies for downstream use and downstream access.
So that's interesting to consider as a kind of, I don't know, moral compass that lies outside the concept of openness, but can usefully guide it in a certain way that is peculiar to openness. Let me explain what I mean and see what you think about this. When Stallman writes that, manifesto, I don't think he's claiming, at least not as I read it, that openness inherently leads to virtue. If we just do all of this all of the time, that's problem solved. But he does insist on the liberatory potential
Yes.
of modes of openness, especially in terms of the software that he, I think quite accurately, foresaw would eventually rule the world. It really is software that brings an enormous amount of our experience into being on a daily basis, much of it invisibly so, of course. So I guess what I would ask would be a question about that liberatory potential and how, in your mind, and how, as you think about the article you wrote, you continue, it appears to me, to believe in the liberatory potential of certain kinds of openness, but only in the context of another set of guiding values, and not as a technologically determined progress toward bliss for everyone and free beer for everyone. So I just love to know what your thinking is about those things, especially since so many writers now are stressing that the internet has not led to liberation.
Right. And I'm sorry, my dog is barking in the background. Should I go shut my door?
Was it a free puppy? That's just what
exactly. Free puppies. We did to get free kittens.
No, go ahead.
Yes, I'm in support of free beer. So at any rate, yes. It's funny that you talk about technological determinism, because I mean, this is something that I've been accused of by colleagues, that I tend to believe that technology is a bit deterministic. Not that it leads to inevitable ends, but that humans have a tendency to, not be able to resist putting our hands in the cookie jar. But yes, I do believe in the liberatory potential of openness, but yes, within a larger framework of social values. And I think the place where I see that playing out ends up not, well, I mean, yes, it's in open source software and in software in general, because that underlies so much of our daily lives, but in education appropriately and governance, right? That, there's a whole large and timely discussion to be had about transparency and openness of government. And we have this section in the paper about the term open source governance, open source democracy, which is a bit of a silly term. But at the same time, the conclusion that we come to in the paper is that that's enabled by education, that government is a complex thing, and you can't realistically go about affecting governance without understanding how it works, right? And that implies education. And so we also talk about, open education, open universities, and the like. But there's some really good research that's been done that shows that, in particular, high-risk students, right? Students that are at risk of dropping out for one reason or another, first-generation college students and the like. What really affects graduation rates is support systems. That, good advising, good systems within the institution to help students achieve their learning goals over the span of the time that they're at the institution. So, the way, in our paper, these were kind of throwaway ideas, honestly, but they've stuck with me. And I'm realizing that backing up and backing up and backing up from governance, you get to these larger social support systems that are required for helping people get over that bar of entry for figuring out how to navigate these open systems. So, yes, openness is beneficial, but before you get to that, you need often, not everybody, but often you need to help people kind of get over that hump of the learning curve. And that implies social structures in place to provide that support and education.
So I think we're going now not so much toward disambiguation as a kind of a nuanced understanding of open itself as a developmental kind of experience, as well as a simply binary description. It is open or it's not, or it's partially open or it's partially not. Open often suggests the door is unlocked, the door is open. But what I'm hearing you suggest is that one's experience of open shifts depending on lots of other factors, education, one's individual context in a particular moment. So how do you think about what you might call, I guess, the developmental aspect of open in relation to the aspirations that openness points to?
I think this is actually where we get into the paper that we were talking about earlier. There's another paper that was published in last year, I've forgotten what month, in First Monday, that's a response to ours, Openness as Social Praxis. And those authors talk about three processes, right? Production, distribution, and consumption of open resources. And it's the use cases, I think, that get at what you're talking about, right? Their argument in response to ours is that we're framing it as a definitional thing. They're looking at what the use of the open resource is, and that our definitions don't make any sense, I think their argument goes, without looking at how the things are being used, right? So ultimately, I think the downstream use by whoever it is, by students, by institutions, et cetera, is where we have to begin the conversation. And it's really sort of an evaluation mindset, right? You start with the ending and you work backwards to how you want to get there.
And that ending implies, as the authors of this article state, a set of aspirations. What do we aspire to when we aspire to openness?
The answer that I would give to that is some form of social justice. That is a bit of a controversial term these days, but honestly, I believe that, and you can define social justice how you like, but I think the end goal, the ultimate use case, the social use case, right, is this flattening out of access across the board, regardless of material resources that a user can bring to bear, right? I mean, that's sort of the principle of open access and open data, that anyone can get at this stuff, that it lowers the bar to both access and potentially participation, right? That if you can download open source tools to work with open data, right? It makes it really easy. Of course, the hard part is getting over the learning curve hump, right? And that's what requires education and support and whatnot. But I think that the ultimate aspiration is one of democratization.
Certainly an answer that makes good sense to me. And it brings it back to this idea of education as an enabler or something that empowers democracy. Yes. And equality of access to some of the more rich and complex structures by which we order our world. This experience that we've got for folks to participate in Open Learning 18 really grew out of a AAC and U kind of liberal learning emphasis on the idea that professional development, faculty development, staff development, anybody related to and working within higher ed, really did need to understand certain basic things about the value of liberal learning, especially in a digital age. So what we run into, and I would say we actually welcome this, is the idea that talking about openness really can be focused as a conversation about information literacy as well, because the great barrier to openness in a democracy such as ours, I would argue, is literacy. If you can't read and you can't write, there are certain modes of participation that are just not going to be available to you. And these are very powerful modes of participation. So we've accepted universal literacy as an aspiration.
Yes.
We want to work to. But what about information literacy? And let me focus the question, and I'm interested in your response. Where does information literacy fit within the framework of the way you think about open? And what would you say are the maybe 2 or 3 most important aspects of information literacy for people trying to get their heads around all the opens?
So information literacy is one of these terms that's been around in my field of library and information science for a long time, and it's kind of forked over the years. But like you say, the idea of information literacy is that we've accepted reading literacy as a baseline for participation in society. And now in an information society, we need some kind of comparable literacy for information resources. The thing about the term information literacy that's a little problematic in library and information science is what that exactly means isn't quite spelled out perfectly. But honestly, as much as anything, it ends up being critical thinking and evaluation about the origin and use of information resources, right? So there's 2 halves to it. There's the personal half of how am I going to use this thing, this piece of information, this book or other resource in my project, whatever it is, right? So there's the personal use case. And then there's the critical thinking about the provenance of the thing, right? Is it from a trustworthy source? What makes sources trustworthy and the like? So that, I think, honestly, is, particularly these days, right, one of the most critical things that we can be teaching students from a very early age, right? I mean, I have an elementary school age kid and they all have phones and they're, looking at Wikipedia and, searching Google and whatnot. And it's this sort of constant conversation that I'm having of, well, this is a reliable source and here's why, right? This is something that has to be taught from a very early age, as reading is taught from a very early age, because by the time, if we wait until we get to higher ed, it's almost too late at that point. But that evaluation mindset, that critical thinking about the origin and individuals and organizations behind information sources is, I think, the most important takeaway for information literacy.
Well, and your very example suggests that there may actually be a qualitative shift in the digital age because of the speed, because of the pervasiveness of information sharing, because Wikipedia would frankly be unimaginable, impossible in a pre-digital age. So I'm curious about ways in which you sense that information literacy has taken on some qualitative differences in the digital age that might be corresponding to what the authors in Openness as Social Practice insist is a qualitative difference, even in the word open in the internet age.
I think in a digital age, the real difference with information literacy is the scale, right? It's not a difference in kind, it's a difference in scale. That information resources are much more readily available. So there's the information overload aspect of we simply have access to more things, and the speed with which those can change, right? You know, when I was coming up, I had to go down to the library, right? Imagine that, and like pull things off of shelves, right? And there was that vetting process that's built into print materials, right? We have a certain amount of trust that the books that the library holds are trustworthy because they've been through a publication, an editorial process, and then another vetting process by the library, right? So what's sitting on the shelves, we have a certain amount of trust in. Where that crutch gets almost completely taken away online. Right? There are, of course, plenty of online resources that go through an editorial process, but there's probably far more that don't. So that editorial and publication process, the quality control filter that implies, the digital age has sort of shown that up as a crutch, right? That was something we leaned on that has not completely, but largely been taken away, putting the burden on the user to do that kind of critical evaluation ourselves. So I think the qualitative difference in the digital age is simply the speed and scale with which we have to face new information resources and the speed at which we have to make our own critical judgments about them. Right? We don't necessarily have the luxury of spending all of this time in the library doing the deep research. It's right there. It's on our screen. We can have some information in seconds. The question is it any good?
So that brings me to what I'll say is the final question I'll have for you, which is a question about expertise. In some respects, you're describing a society in which, I guess, best case, expertise is more widely distributed and everyone has to take on a little more of that responsibility, or the idea of expertise begins to be devalued because there's no one conspicuously in that position. Yes. One trusts or even knows about. And I'm sure you're aware that the argument about expertise is an argument that people have used against democracy itself.
Oh, yes.
Or even, a jury of your peers and all the rest of that. So I'm interested. I mean, you can see I'm grappling with some really complex questions here, but I know that they pop up all the time, especially with my colleagues. To what extent does openness affect the idea of expertise?
Well, I mean, the argument against expertise is one that's, this is a common discussion in, the modern United States. And yes, I think that's the downside of this new environment of information resources. And, again, back to my previous comment about the work that's being done on sort of algorithmic, inequality and whatnot. There's an interesting debate to be had about that. The problem is not access to information. We've got that licked, right? That the problem now is overload of information. And so there's a sort of a new form of, if you want to call it censorship, I'm not sure what the appropriate term would be, honestly, where it's attention being diverted rather than restricting information resources, right? It's sort of just the overload of you can't pay attention to everything, and so you don't get access to information that might actually be useful because you're looking over here instead of over there. So I actually do believe that the expertise needs to be pushed off onto all of us, that looking to a community expert or field expert is still valuable, obviously, right? This is the business you and I are both in. But at the same time, right, the expertise of evaluating information, the work, and of course, this is the lens coming from an information science background, but I think that information science and the information evaluation mindset is absolutely critical, and everyone needs to gain that expertise, because we're just living in that kind of an environment where without it, information comes at us and we have access to too many resources to wait for the expert on the subject. And, yes, there's a great deal of variation. There's some interesting work in my field on information gatekeepers, for example, that where, particularly for language subcommunities, right? You get the person whose English is better, perhaps, who's the one who brings information to the community. And that's all well and good, but as a general trend, I think all of us need to develop that expertise to do the evaluation of information sources, the usefulness for our own personal uses, as well as understanding a bit about the media landscape, right? And this gets away from information science into media studies, right? What are the sources that are producing information resources? Where do those come from? What's the origin? Who's behind those? What organizations are behind those? So for all of us to gain a bit of media literacy as well.
Well, it certainly sounds like parts of a new liberal arts curriculum, whether it situates itself as the study of objects or practice or both. I think in some ways it's a kind of a wave particle idea. But I think it fits very well with what we're trying to do in Open Learning 18, situating our understanding of these concepts in a praxis in which we're actually exercising these varieties of openness ourselves as we seek understanding. So I just want to thank you again, Jeffrey Pomerantz, for writing that terrific article with Robin Peake, and I appreciate your taking the time and your openness. Another kind of openness indeed, to be with us today and to have this conversation. And I will look forward to hearing more of your thoughts as the world continues to turn. So
thank you very much for doing this. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of this stuff. It's been living in my head for a very long time. It's good to have an audience and a group who's also thinking in similar directions. So thank you very much.